Hi, I'm Jamie McKeever. Welcome to my channel and welcome to the first in my next short series of videos, which is called Historical Asides. In these next few videos, I want to delve more into the historical side of humour, looking more into the background and context rather than the martial arts and fencing components. In this particular video, I want to delve into a claim that Vadi makes in his preface, which is that he learnt from a wide variety of different masters and combined them into a single art. And I want to specifically look at which masters we have available that might have had a link to Vadi and show how the particular sources that he seems to have drawn from tell us some interesting things about fencing in Italy in the late 15th century. So first of all, Vadi's source. If you're here, you probably already know this. Vadi wrote this, which is called De Arte Gladiatoria di Nicandi, roughly translates to The Art of Combat. And it was written sometime around 1482 to 87 and dedicated to the young Duke Guidobaldo de Montefeltro of the city of Urbino. It's a relatively short text by comparison to some others, but even within that, we see quite a lot of links to other masters that are interesting to talk about. So, if you look at this timeline here, these are all the masters that are contemporary to Vadi and which we can find some kind of link to his text. The first two I want to talk about are Fiore de Libri and Ludwig von Eyb. I've placed Ludwig von Eyb here as the only named representative of the German Blume de Kampf trilogy of manuscripts that we've got, and it's been long speculated that there is a link between these manuscripts and Fiore's. Fiore is the more well-known of the two. Fiore wrote several manuscripts at the start of the 15th century, generally speaking called some variation of the Flower of Battle. And the reason we can be sure that Vadi had access to one of these manuscripts is there are a lot of similarities to various plates within both. In particular, there are plays outside of the longsword, but some in the longsword as well, look like they may have been almost copied from, as Michael Chidester has pointed out to me, the Blume de Kampf version rather than the Fiore version. But we also know that there's probably a copy of a Fiore manuscript that Vadi's had access to because various bits of the preface seem to be copied from Fiore's preface with the details removed. As well as the preface and some of the plays, a few of the guards are described similarly, although not many, and also some basic actions like cuts have similar rhyming pairs that go with them to some of the Fiore manuscripts. So it seems like Vadi has had access to the manuscript, although it by no means is the entirety of his work, a copy of Fiore. Moving on to one of Vadi's contemporaries, this is probably the least of a link. We have Pietro Monte. Well, there's not really any link between Vadi and Monte about what to do in fencing, what's good idea in fencing. Vadi does have a chapter called Defense Against the Rising Strike, which is specifically targeting an opponent who favors alternating rising strikes from either side with the two-handed sword. That approach is the approach suggested by Monte. So while we can't be sure whether there was any kind of link or this was intentional, it does seem like there is a very pointed and targeted chapter against defeating someone who is fencing exactly like Monte. Moving on to the third group, we have the Bolognese masters. Starting with Filippo Vadi, of which we have no surviving text. Vadi was a fencing master in the city of Bologna. He was also a university master. We know that he wrote a book that talks about the link between fencing and geometry. We don't have access to it, so we don't know the content to it, but this argument of fencing and geometry being aligned is also present in Vadi. The other Bolognese masters, we can also see links to Vadi. I don't have a copy in front of me. You have Achille Marozzo, which we can see some strong similarities between some of Marozzo's two-handed sword guards and Vadi's. We have masters such as Manciolino, Dalla Gocchia, Giovanni Dalla Gocchia, the Anonimo Bolognesi, and Angelo Vigiani. As well as the similarities I've already mentioned, all of these have a strong emphasis on the use of tempo as a central concept for fencing, and the conception of the link between guards and tempo, which we see present in Vadi as well. Certain other terms, such as mezzotempo, mezzospada, appear in both, and some of the ways that Vadi talks about cuts bear strong similarities to the way that the Bolognese masters do, but although they're not identical, particularly the use of the terms reverso and mandritto, that we do not see earlier in Fiore, appear for the first time in written text that we have in Vadi, and become ubiquitous throughout the rest of the Bolognese tradition. So many of the concepts and terms are very strongly linked to the Bolognese fencing, although of course it's not a complete overlap here either. And indeed what we see in Vadi is some links to Fiore, some links to the Bolognese tradition, a description of how to defeat Monte, and some unique content that does not appear to be anywhere else or any other source that we currently have access to, which is exactly what we'd expect given what Vadi tells us in his preface. As you can see from the timeline, some of these masters were contemporary to Vadi, Most of them were within 80 years of him publishing his book. But as well as being close in time, what's interesting to see is that all these masters are closely related in terms of where they are in Italy as well. The map you see here is taken from Wikimedia Commons, and it shows Italy in 1494. There's a lot of irrelevant details for us, so we're going to remove them, and we're going to add cities that I want to talk about shortly, and we'll cover all of them in a second. So focusing just on the Italian masters, we're going to ignore Lobid. Let's look at where we can trace their lives to within Italy, starting with Fiore. Fiore, we know, was born in Primarico, in the northeast of Italy. He says so in his preface, and we could also place him leading a mercenary company in Udine, which is a city near Primarico. We have a bunch of biographical details from his preface, most of which are involving who he was teaching to fence in a duel, and most of the names that we can trace are all traced back to the Duchy of Milan. So it's long been speculated that Fiore was probably in service of the Duchy of Milan in some way, shape or form. Of the fencing texts we have access to, two of them are dedicated to Niccolo III, who was the ruler of Ferrara, and we know that the manuscript ended up in the library at Ferrara. Whether Fiore gave them directly and spent some time at the court, or whether these were diplomatic gifts from Milan is unknown and often speculated about, but regardless, we can link him to Ferrara. Moving on to Vadi, there's a few places we can place him. First of all, his full name, Philippo Vadi Pisano, or de Pisa, indicates that he was probably born in the city of Pisa. Interestingly, at the time, Pisa would have been a newly conquered city, recently conquered by the Republic of Florence, which might explain why Vadi didn't seem to spend the rest of his life anywhere near Pisa. After that, the next place we can place him is Venice, up in the northeast, where we have a medallion that was cast in 1457 that would have been commissioned by Vadi. We can also place him in Ferrara. There are a bunch of poems which I've talked about on my blog, which are in the library at Ferrara. One of them is dedicated to Duke Borso d'Este, who's the son of Niccolo III, and Duke of Ferrara and Modena in his own right. And all of them were in the library of Ferrara. Finally, we have his own fencing manuscript, which was gifted to the Duke of Urbino sometime between 1482 and 1487, Duke Guidobaldo of Urbino. Monte is the next in time on our list. Monte was a fairly famous mercenary captain. He can be placed to quite a few regions of Italy, mostly in the service of the Duchy of Milan, but we can also place him in the city of Urbino. We know that he was part of the court at some point. He's mentioned in Baldassare Castiglione's The Courtier, which is about the Duchy of Urbino, the court of Urbino, and it's been long believed he spent some time there as a fencing master as well. Finally, the Bolognese masters. Well, we call them the Bolognese masters, but most of them aren't from Bologna. We can definitively place Dardi to Bologna. That's without doubt. We know he had a fencing school there. We know he was a university master there. We can also definitively place Manciolino and Arozzo to Bologna. Vigiani, we can place to Padua. His book was posthumously published in Padua, but also there's a character in the book which is called Bocca di Ferro, who's a philosopher that they call on to talk about temper with. Bocca di Ferro was the name of a university professor at the University of Padua teaching logic and philosophy. So we have a very strong connection for Vigiani to Padua. The Anonimo Bolognese was found in Ravenna. We don't know if it was written there. That's where it was found. We really have no other details about who wrote it or where they lived apart from that. And finally, we have Dalla Gocchia. His book was published in Venice. So as you can see from this map, all of these fencing masters were not only close in time, but very close in geography. What's interesting is if you compare Vadi to some of their contemporaries that weren't in this region, for instance, Agrippa, who was about the same time as Marozzo, you don't see the same kind of strong links. While some of these concepts like tempo appear in the Roman sources, they are much less central than they are the Bolognese sources, and there they seem to be taking on a much more subsidiary role. Apart from that, there don't seem to be any links to Vadi, so the link is incredibly minor and probably explicable just by the use of language. So to wrap up, there's just a few points I want to make about this. I think it is unsurprising that we are finding these links. Vadi, in fact, tells us they're going to be there when he tells us that he's learned from a bunch of different masters. There's no way to know the nature of the link. Vadi could have had access to the sources, or maybe he had access to one of the students or masters involved. And in the case of people like Monte and the Anonimo Bolognese, it's possible he actually crossed blades or learnt from either of them at some point. However, what's particularly interesting is that these are essentially all of the sources from this region of Italy that we have surviving into the modern period. And there is at least some evidence of a link to Vadi for all of them. The fact that there are at least some links to Vadi in all these sources shows that there is some kind of culture of sharing ideas and swordsmanship across the region at the time. Whether Vadi was the exception or it was the norm, of course, we don't know. There's just so many missing pieces of information that we don't have. But Vadi himself at least seems to have been able to travel around and learn from different places and different masters. So, in conclusion, just as Vadi tells us, he did indeed seem to travel around, he did indeed seem to learn from multiple fencing masters, although perhaps he was not as widely travelled as he wants to make us believe. And he appears to have been in a bit of Italy that was particularly good for this because there was such a rich and diverse range of masters teaching in that area. In my next video, I'm going to explore a bit about Vadi's life, talk a bit about who he was and why he might have been travelling particularly around this region of Italy and why it might have been attractive to him. I hope you enjoyed this one, and like and subscribe for similar content.